All right, so today we're diving into a topic that's been all over the headlines.
Yeah.
Iran's role in the Middle East.
It's been quite a bit, hasn't it?
But we're going deeper than the headlines, right?
Absolutely.
We're trying to understand this complex situation from Iran's perspective.
And it's a perspective that's often, gets missed
Yeah, exactly.
in the broader conversation.
We're talking about the axis of resistance,
Right.
this network of alliances that Iran has been building for
A
decades.
long time, yeah.
And we've got some fascinating research here
Yeah.
that sheds light on how it all came together, who the players are, and how events like the 2023 conflict have really just shaken things up.
It's a fascinating story.
It really is.
And it starts with a surprising fact.
No?
The term axis of resistance wasn't even coined by Iran.
Really?
Yeah, it actually originated with Muammar Gaddafi's Libya
Wow.
as a counter to President Bush's Axis of Evil label.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so Iran prefers the term resistance front, and the idea itself goes back to the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s.
So Iran comes out of that war 8 years of just brutal fighting.
Brutal fighting.
And what's the situation for them when they come out of that?
They're devastated.
Yeah.
Yeah. Their economy's in ruins, their infrastructure is shattered, and they realize, they're isolated.
They're vulnerable.
They're very vulnerable.
Yeah.
This experience leads to a major shift
Yeah.
in their thinking about defense.
So they can't afford another conventional war.
No.
What do?
They shift their focus to deterrence, building up a missile program
Right.
to make any potential attacker think twice.
Makes sense.
And they start to cultivate allies outside of the traditional state framework.
So this is where things start to get really interesting.
Yeah.
They're not looking for these traditional alliances with other countries.
Right.
They're reaching out to movements. Groups that share their goal of resisting it.
Exactly.
So it's a different kind of network
They're
building.
They're building what we might call
Yeah.
a coalition of the willing groups.
Yeah.
With very different backgrounds and ideologies.
Right.
But united by this common goal.
Okay, so walk me through this. Who are some of the key players in this resistance front?
Well, one of the earliest and most important is Hezbollah in Lebanon. Official Iranian support for them starts in 1993.
Okay.
They were a natural fit, already engaged in armed resistance against Israel.
But I'm guessing it's not as simple as just finding groups that share a common enemy.
No.
How does Iran manage all of these relationships? That can't be easy to keep everybody on the same page.
You're absolutely right. The idea of a perfectly unified, ideologically aligned front,
Right.
that's a myth.
Yeah.
The reality is far more complex and contradictory.
So give me an example. Where do we see these contradictions?
We'll take Syria under Hafez al-Assad.
Okay.
They were an ally of Iran.
Right.
But that alliance was driven more by shared interests than shared ideology. In fact, during Lebanon's War of the Brothers in the 1980s, Syria actually backed the Amal movement, which was fighting against Hezbollah.
Wow. So even within this so-called resistance front, you've got allies fighting against each other.
That's right.
That really highlights the complexity here.
It does.
It's not just about ideology.
No.
It's about power strategy.
Totally.
Shifting alliances.
Yeah.
It's real politic at play here.
Yeah, it is.
And we see this complexity play out even within Iran's own decision-making.
Yes.
Right? There were debates within Iran about how to engage with Hamas, for example.
Right.
Hamas and Iran have different approaches to political Islam.
They do.
And that created some friction.
It did.
So even deciding who to support and how to support them
Yes.
wasn't always straightforward for Iran.
It was.
They had to weigh different factors.
Yes.
Sometimes prioritizing pragmatism over ideology.
Exactly.
So it wasn't just about finding groups that were ideologically pure.
No.
It was about finding groups that could advance Iran's strategic interests. So we've got this complex web of alliances driven by a mix of ideology, pragmatism, strategic calculations.
Yeah.
And then in 2006, we have the Lebanon War,
Yes.
which really puts Hezbollah on the map.
Right.
Was this a turning point for the resistance front as a whole?
It was a significant moment, no doubt about it.
How so?
Hezbollah's performance in that war, holding their own against a much larger,
Right.
better equipped Israeli military, had a major impact.
But was it really a victory for Hezbollah, like some claimed?
That's right.
Or were the costs too high?
Yeah, that's a great question.
And how did it affect their long-term strategy and their relationship with Iran?
The notion of victory in that conflict is definitely debated.
Okay.
Hezbollah did manage to withstand the Israeli offensive and inflict casualties, which boosted their image as a resistance force. But they also suffered significant losses, and parts of Lebanon were heavily damaged.
So a tactical success maybe, but at a high cost?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that Hezbollah's tactics in that war, relying heavily on guerrilla warfare and rocket attacks, are very different from how Iran would have fought a conventional war.
Yeah, totally different approach.
But Iran was happy to see Hezbollah take on a more prominent role within the resistance front, even with their different approaches.
Interesting.
So a bit of a mixed bag for Iran, but overall, they see Hezbollah's performance as a win.
Got it.
For the resistance front.
Okay, so a win for the resistance front, but then just a few years later, the Syrian Civil War breaks out.
Yes.
And that throws a real wrench into the works.
It does.
How so?
The Syrian Civil War exposed deep tensions within the resistance front. Hamas, for example, sided with the Syrian people against the Assad regime, which put them at odds with Iran.
That's a huge rift.
It is.
It really challenges this whole idea that the resistance front is driven purely by ideology.
It does.
Here you have Hamas breaking with Iran, one of their main backers, over a conflict that doesn't directly involve Israel.
Right, and that rift highlighted the limits of Iranian influence.
Yeah.
They couldn't control the actions of their allies.
Right.
And their support wasn't unconditional.
Right.
It was a reminder that these alliances are built on shifting sands.
Yeah.
And realpolitik often trumps ideology.
So we've seen how the resistance front has evolved over time, from its origins in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq War to the rise of Hezbollah.
Yes.
To the cracks that emerged during the Syrian Civil War.
Right.
But then in 2023, we have this major escalation, a conflict unlike anything we've seen before.
Yeah.
What happened on October 7th that changed everything?
October 7, 2023 was a watershed moment.
Tell me about it.
Hamas launched a surprise attack against Israel. Far exceeding anything they'd attempted before.
Wow. So this wasn't just another border skirmish.
No.
The scale and audacity of the attack were shocking.
I was shocked.
Did Iran know this was coming?
That's a good question.
Did they have any role in planning it?
That's a question intelligence agencies around the world are still grappling with.
About that.
What we do know is that the speed and intensity of Israel's response with the full backing of the United States was unexpected.
Wow.
Even by Iran.
So even Iran, a country that's often portrayed as the mastermind behind all of this, was caught off guard.
It seems that way.
Wow.
And the fallout was swift and brutal.
Yeah.
We saw targeted assassinations of key figures within the resistance front, including Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah, and Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas.
Hold on, those are huge names.
Huge names.
The leaders of Hezbollah and Hamas taken out just like that?
Just like that.
What message was that supposed to send?
It was a clear signal that the old rules no longer applied. Israel, with U.S. support, was willing to escalate in a way that we hadn't seen before.
This must have been a major wake-up call for Iran.
It was.
I mean, they had invested heavily in building up this network of allies.
They had.
And suddenly it seemed incredibly vulnerable.
It did. It was a moment of reckoning for Iran.
It sounds like it.
And what's even more interesting is that this external shock coincided with some significant internal developments. There were already growing debates within Iran about the direction of the country, about the economy, about social freedoms.
So it's not just about external threats, it's also about internal pressures.
Absolutely. The events of 2023 exposed those internal tensions and amplified them. Suddenly, the question of what comes next for Iran, what kind of role they want to play in the region, became even more urgent.
And this is all happening against the backdrop of a potential leadership change in Iran.
It is.
Like the current supreme leader isn't getting any younger?
No, he's not.
What are the conversations like in Iran right now about succession?
That's a great question.
I bet it is.
The question of who will succeed the current supreme leader is probably the most sensitive and closely guarded secret in Iran. But we know there are different factions, different schools of thought vying for influence.
Can you break that down for me? What are some of the main camps?
Sure.
And how do their views differ?
On one end of the spectrum, you have the hardliners. They believe that Iran should double down on its revolutionary principles, maintain its defiance of the West, and continue to support its allies in the resistance front, regardless of the cost. They see compromise as weakness.
So for them, it's about staying the course.
Staying the course.
Even if that course has become more dangerous.
Yes, for them it's about ideological purity and resisting any attempts to soften Iran's stance.
So that's one end of the spectrum. What about the other end?
On the other end of the spectrum, you have the pragmatists.
Okay.
They argue that Iran needs to be more realistic about its capabilities.
Okay.
Focus on economic development and improving the lives of ordinary Iranians.
Right.
And be willing to engage in dialogue with its adversaries.
So more of a focus on internal stability.
Internal stability.
And less on external adventures.
Exactly. They believe that Iran can't afford to be isolated.
Right.
And that it needs to find ways to de-escalate tensions.
Okay.
And secure its interests through diplomacy.
And they're the reformers, right?
Yeah.
People who want to see more fundamental changes in Iran's political system.
That's right.
And more freedoms for its citizens.
Yes. The reformers are a significant force as well.
Okay.
Though they have faced a lot of repression in recent years.
Yeah, I can imagine.
They argue that Iran needs to open up politically and socially.
Okay.
Address issues like corruption and human rights abuses.
Right.
And become a more normal country integrated into the global community.
It sounds like there are some pretty fundamental disagreements within Iran.
There are.
About what the future should look like.
Deep disagreements.
How are those disagreements playing out?
These debates are happening at all levels of Iranian society.
Oh.
In the halls of power, in the media, in universities.
Wow.
Even in private homes.
So it's happening everywhere.
It's happening everywhere.
Yeah.
It's a very dynamic and fluid situation.
So it's not as simple as saying Iran wants this.
No.
Or Iran believes that.
Not at all.
There's a whole spectrum of viewpoints.
There is.
And internal dynamics that we need to be aware of.
Absolutely.
Precisely. And those internal dynamics are going to be crucial.
They are.
In determining how Iran responds to the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. This brings us back to the axis of resistance.
Okay.
If Iran does decide to shift toward a more pragmatic foreign policy, what does that mean for its allies, like Hezbollah and Hamas?
That's a key question.
It is.
If Iran starts to prioritize its own survival and stability, will it be willing to continue providing the same level of support to groups that are still committed to armed struggle against Israel?
It's a really good question.
It is.
So much to consider here.
It's complex.
Yeah.
It is.
That's a fascinating question. It's almost like Iran is caught between a rock and a hard place. If they pull back their support, they risk alienating these groups that have been their allies for decades.
That's right.
But if they continue to provide unwavering support, they risk further escalation and conflict.
Absolutely.
With Israel and the U.S.
Right.
It's a real dilemma for them.
It is a dilemma.
And it's important to remember that groups like Hezbollah and Hamas are not just passive recipients of Iranian aid.
No, they're not.
They have their own agendas, their own constituencies.
Absolutely.
And their own calculations about what's in their best interest.
Their own calculations.
So they're not just going to blindly follow whatever Iran tells them to do.
No, not at all.
They have to be responsive to their own internal dynamics.
Right.
And the reality is there are already signs that these groups are having to adapt to the changing circumstances.
They are.
Can you give me some examples of how they're adapting?
Sure. We're seeing signs that some of these groups are trying to diversify their sources of support.
Okay.
Looking beyond Iran to countries like Russia or China.
Interesting.
They're also exploring ways to engage in more political and diplomatic activities rather than relying solely on armed struggle.
So a bit of a shift from bullets to ballots.
In some cases, yes, but it's not a uniform shift.
Right.
Within these groups, there are debates about how to respond to the changing regional landscape.
Makes sense.
Some factions are more willing to compromise and engage in dialogue, while others remain committed to a more hardline approach.
I imagine the generational divide plays a role here as well.
It does.
The younger generation of leaders within these groups, they've grown up in a different world than their predecessors.
They have. The old guard, the leaders who came of age during the Iran-Iraq War or the early days of the Palestinian Intifada, they have a certain worldview shaped by those experiences.
For sure.
But the younger generation, they're more connected to the globalized world. They're more aware of the costs of conflict. And they may be more open to exploring different paths.
So what does this all mean for the future of the resistance front?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Is
it falling apart? Is it evolving?
Yeah.
I think it's too early to say for sure.
Okay.
What's clear is that we're in a period of transition.
Yeah, it feels like it.
The old certainties are gone. The regional order is in flux.
It's changing,
And these groups, including Iran, are having to grapple with some very difficult choices.
So if you're trying to make sense of all of this, What are the key takeaways?
Right.
What should we be paying attention to in the coming months and years?
I'd say there are a few key things to watch.
Okay.
First, pay attention to the internal dynamics within Iran.
Okay.
The outcome of the succession struggle will have a major impact on the country's foreign policy and its relationship with its allies.
So who comes to power in Iran matters a lot.
It matters a great deal.
What else should we be watching?
Second, keep an eye on how groups like Hezbollah and Hamas adapt to the changing regional landscape.
Okay.
Will they become more pragmatic?
Right.
Will they splinter into factions?
Right.
Will they seek out new patrons?
Okay, what's the third thing?
Third, don't underestimate the power of unforeseen events.
Oh, that's a good one.
The Middle East is a region prone to surprises.
Yeah, definitely.
A single incident, a miscalculation, could trigger a chain reaction with far-reaching consequences.
The story of the axis of resistance is far from over.
It's not over.
It's entering a new chapter.
It is.
And the ending is still being written.
Still being written.
It's been a fascinating deep dive.
It has.
Any final thoughts for our listener before we wrap up?
Just this. The axis of resistance, despite its name, is not some monolithic, unchanging entity.
Okay.
It's a dynamic network of relationships shaped by history, ideology, pragmatism.
Right.
And a whole lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, there's a lot we don't know.
There is.
As you follow the news and analysis, keep that complexity in mind.
Yes.
It's the key to understanding what's really going on. Great advice. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
And to you, our listener, thanks for coming along for the ride.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.